Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and have a discussion on this important topic, identity in a digital world. I was actually just exchanging a couple of thoughts with some panelists here, and we ended up telling some funny and slightly embarrassing stories about ourselves in the past, which I won't repeat now. But it made me reflect that when we talk about our identity, it's a very complex and it's very subjective, and it's a very personal thing. Each of us carry that around us all the time. And in an increasingly digital world, how we are represented online, our digital identity, is increasingly the cornerstone of how we engage in society and economy. And I deliberately don't say digital economy and digital society because increasingly there is no difference between the economy and the digital economy, or society and the digital economy and the digital society. Identity really provides the foundation in terms of the levels of inclusion, whether it's economic, social, political, or the opportunities that are available to people, economic innovation, criminal justice goals, who we are as individuals, and how that can be understood and managed, and by who and when and for what purposes, is really going to be, I think, one of the critical defining questions as we continue to race into this digital future. So I'm very delighted here to have an incredibly expert set of minds that will be able to help us navigate through some of the deep questions here. And so I will hand straight over to Eileen to kick us off and lead us through a great discussion.
Thanks so much, Derek. So first of all, thank you everybody for being here at the end of a long day, on the fourth day of an incredibly rich event. So we really appreciate you being here, and we're hopeful that the people who are in this room are the ones who deeply care about this topic of what is identity in the digital world. I'm going to take 2 minutes to sort of frame the challenges around digital identity. And then before turning to our panelists, I'm going to throw it to everybody who's here. And so I'm giving you a little bit of a heads up and ask a couple of questions. So as Derek just said, digital identity is a really multi-layered topic. It forces us to address questions at an abstract level, like what is identity and what is digital identity? Social, political, economic questions about privacy, security, inclusion. Technical layer questions with respect to interoperability or security standards. There is obviously tremendous energy building around this concept of digital identity at the nation state level, which we will hear about, within industry, and also within civil society. All of these stakeholder groups are aware that there is great potential beneficial upside to this technology. But it's, as we say, it's really complex. So digital ID could be a game changer with respect to the provision of government services, with respect to humanitarian relief, with respect to anti-corruption, poverty reduction, and even has the potential to solve intractable problems that we have not been able to address in the pre-digital era, such as legal identity, and potentially fulfill one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 16.9, which pledges to provide legal identity for all. A billion people around the world do not have legal identity by the year 2030. That said, no other technology except perhaps facial recognition technology, which can be related, has brought to the surface such deep concerns about privacy, security, especially for individuals and vulnerable groups, and even fear of a global move toward digital authoritarianism. What I like about this topic for this group is that in many ways the challenges of digital identity are emblematic of the core dilemmas we face with respect to the whole move toward digitization of society writ large, which is how do we find a way to capitalize on the upside benefits of the technology, in this case digital ID, for economic development, and just to address global challenges, at the same time that we protect against the downside risks to people and society. So, before I turn to our panelists, I just wanted to throw out the general abstract question to you all. When you hear the term digital identity, what comes to mind? If anybody, throw out an answer. All right, another way I can do this. When you hear digital identity, do you think of username, password combos that allow you to access services on the web? Anybody, raise your hand if that's your primary entry point. What about, who thinks about digital footprint and the little markers we leave around with social media and purchases and stuff like that? Okay, what about, how many of you think about, or your minds go to this idea of a national digital identity system for e-services? Okay, so those are just 3 different ways to cut at the problem. And so we want you to know that we are all aware that when people talk about digital identity, they can mean very different things when they use the same term. And so we wanted to put that out there up front. So we have a really incredible panel with us today. I'll quickly introduce Nandan Nilekani, chairman of Infosys, and also the chief architect of the National Digital Identity System in India, known as Aadhaar. We have Leanne Kemp, the chief executive officer and founder of Everledger, leader in blockchain technology. Catherine Borchert, Chief Open Innovation Officer at Mozilla, and Mike Kubzansky is the managing partner at the Omidyar network, and he's really deeply involved in the global conversation about what constitutes a good digital identity. So I'm going to start with Nandan and ask you to discuss the Indian model and the experience. Yeah. Give us a sense of what was the real vision, the beneficial upside. If it fulfilled your wildest dreams, what would that look like?
Yeah, so I think the Indian ID system, it's called Aadhaar, which means foundation, was, the implementation began 10 years back, but the idea predates that to about 2006. And really there were 2 drivers for that. The first was that many parts of India have a weak civil registration system. So there are Indian states where more than 50% of the births are not registered. So you have children growing up without any document of existence. And that was okay in the old days when people lived and spent the entire time in the same village. But in an increasingly migrant population where people went from villages to cities and so on, lack of ID was a great impediment in them being able to fulfill their lives in getting a job, boarding a train, or getting school education or whatever. So lack of identity was becoming a barrier. So one reason for an ID project was to address inclusion of those people who didn't have basic root documents. The second thing was that over the last 20 years, India has been building a welfare state and spending a large amount of money in benefits which go directly to individuals, be it pensions, scholarships, unemployment insurance, and so on. And as they started spending more and more money on these programs, they realized to their horror that 20, 30, 40% was getting wasted because there was no underlying way of identifying the beneficiaries. So there's a lot of fraud and wastage. So there are 2 drivers: inclusion of people who didn't have basic documents, and how to make sure government expenditure becomes more efficient. So the project was to give everyone a unique ID. But the fact that it was a digital ID was really taken up because we said that if in 2009, if we want to give IDs to people, we might as well give digital IDs. So in some sense, the project was really to give basic ID, but giving it as a digital ID was possible in today's world. The challenge we had was, how do you give digital IDs to 1 billion people who don't have any documents? Because how do you make sure that everyone has only one ID? How do you make sure everybody gets only one unique ID? Because we build an ID system and some people start getting multiple IDs, then the whole thing is lost. The whole idea of one ID is to make sure they don't claim benefits multiply and so on. And we came to the conclusion that the only way to do that was through biometric deduplication, that the biometric was the only way that you could make sure that somebody was unique. And this was designed in 2009 when biometrics had not really progressed to where it was today. And we built a biometric deduplication based on fingerprints, iris, and photograph. We felt that with that level of digital granularity, we'll be able to get uniqueness on 1 billion people. So that was the technology that was built. It was built an open source platform, highly scalable. It was built to enroll 1.5 million people a day. And at peak, we had 35,000 enrollment stations across the country. The data is very, very minimalistic and simple. So this is not a data gathering system. This is just an ID system. It has the name, address, very simple things. And we make sure everybody gets only one number through the uniqueness of biometrics. And you can also do online authentication using fingerprint, iris, face, or through a OTP. And this is the basis for a lot of things today. 1.2 billion people have the ID. It's also 600 million of them have linked their bank accounts to the ID. And this also is the basis for the world's largest cash transfer program. So billions of dollars are transferred electronically in real time to people's accounts for benefits. It allows you to open instant bank accounts and mobile connections. So the whole host of things it does. So basically, it's a way to use ID to include 1 billion people, and also a way to make sure they get access to all the benefits they deserve. So in a nutshell, I can come back to this later because a lot of complexities. Mm-hmm. But this was the project, and it's run.
Super quick follow-up. Is this model replicable, or is there something about this choice of technology that makes it work and feasible in India, less so elsewhere?
When we began, there were a lot of unknowns, whether you could do deduplication at 1 billion people. Now we have solved all those problems. They're all known problems. And technology has advanced. So I don't think implementing an ID system of the type that we have described is becoming easier and easier because technology has moved. But making such projects work is not about technology alone. It's about there has to be political will, there has to be bureaucratic alignment, and so on, and lots of other issues, nothing to do with technology.
Yep.
But we'll come back to that. But now there's a global interest. Maybe Mike will talk about that.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to shift. We're going to go to Leanne because I want to sort of do a little bit of a comparison of technology choices, the underlying technology. So tell us about the role of blockchain in this and specific uses that are beneficial and what's distinctive about the underlying authentication technology.
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting panel because I think about identity in a slightly different way and not necessarily the identity of people or companies. I look at it from the construct of identity of objects and the application that it would sit within the transparency layer or provenance of a supply chain. And certainly when we understand parts of the supply chains that exist in the world and metals and minerals that are a core ingredient to the electronic devices that probably every person here has sitting in their pocket, the traceability of these objects of value is increasingly important, especially considering our financial system has only really thought about risk and aggregated risk and identified risk from a KYC layer, so a know your customer. And what if we were able to flip that around the other way to KYO, know your object, and we could actually take a digital twin of that object into a distributed data layer like blockchain using technology so that it could be shared across an entire supply chain or across an entire global industry. I don't subscribe to blockchain being the only technology that can provide a shared data layer service, but certainly it is a new technology that shouldn't be ignored. And we are seeing applications in the space certainly being explored and experimented in financial services, banks and insurance companies, in monetary sort of transfer of funds across borders and peer-to-peer technologies. And then, of course, deeply in supply chain traceability. And at the very heart and the very core of the purpose of my company is to think about how we can bring transparency to opaque supply chains, those that have held and guarded probably the most secrets of the world's wealth, and how can we enable a little bit more transparency for it to be known.
So do you, again, on this question of broader applicability of this technology. So clearly you're deeply into this transparency and supply chain issues. Could it be utilized by a government as it relates to legal identity?
So absolutely, and we're seeing commitments by governments made in its application. Dubai would come to the front of my mind in their whole of government commitment to release blockchain as a core fabric of government, not only in terms of registries and certification, but also in the use of identity. And there are whispers that it will be used as a part of the international visa and passport system as well, no short of 2020. I'm the Premier appoint as the Queensland Chief Entrepreneur, and in my own state, we're exploring the use of blockchain in terms of procurement, so opening up the government transparency purse so that we're able to see and know and understand. From another construct of government, there's certainly an interesting set of applications being flirted with in opening transparency around the democracy process. So who do we vote for? And is it truly based on the votes of people, or are there influences that are beyond the votes of people?
Great. So let's shift over to Katharina. And again, we're going to stay on this topic of the positive vision as a start. We will get to the risks in a minute. But from your vantage point, from a user's vantage point, from citizens' vantage point, what are the beneficial applications of this technology?
If you get it right, obviously a lot of the things that had already been mentioned, it can ensure inclusion of all the people that currently are not able to identify themselves. If you get it right and you actually build a technology that acts as a user agent, and can be incredibly empowering and enabling, because you can build a system that that does not only identify me, but also allows me to identify my actions. But I think the crucial point is always asking, with everything that we do and that we care about, we always come from a very, very user-centric perspective. And it's about empowerment and enabling users. And so that, for me, is one of the critical pillars when thinking about this technology and when designing systems for this.
So we heard earlier about a sort of a nation-state model and provision of government services. Have you explored a more globalized model, a borderless model of digital ID? And what might be the benefits of that?
I'm not sure we're the right people to explore that. What we are exploring is what can we learn from examples like India, where this is currently implemented, both in terms of things that are empowering, that work well, but also the many learnings that do not work so well. Mm-hmm. And how can we help think about this and come from user-first, user-centric principles and build the frameworks that you need to successfully implement something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Mike, we'll shift to you, and we're going to use you as a little bit of a transition to the second big bucket of questions. First case, if anything was unsaid about the beneficial vision, the positive upside, please share that. But then start getting us to, how do you think about the downside risks, and what are the real concerns you have?
Sure. That's I think the positive case for ID has been well made. I think we look at it from the point of view of for those who come from the development community. You remember, once upon a time there was an MDG about education, right? And it was primarily about providing access to elementary schooling, and so the community geared up and provided access to that, but it wasn't necessarily quality schooling, and people didn't pay attention to quality schooling. So the other side of the equation isn't simply providing the access, but it's providing what we call good ID. And so we'd say, and this is a bit of a riff on what you were saying, which is this notion of good ID is ID that empowers the individual to use it when she wants to say no when she doesn't want to. These are features that are actually built into the Indian system, for instance. And have the user control and privacy considerations at the center. So as we think about building out state and other IDs, we try to talk about good ID as a term that we actually try to define in those terms, in terms of user control. And so And we would think of both state-issued IDs and de facto digital trails, which a number of people raised their hands for, as being subject to the same set of considerations that you would want to have to empower people to permission, control, use the data when they want to, when it empowers them, not use it when they don't want to. So, not surprisingly, the downsides, as you might imagine, come when that's not possible, right? And so, obviously, the biggest downside is around the concentration of power, right? Which is both in the hands of, if it's your social media platform, which has the power over you in terms of the privacy and the data, or from the government side in terms of creating a sort of surveillance state or surveillance capitalism. Either are bad, and those are very large risks that we need to take into account. Now, there are ways that can be addressed. I hope we'll get to talk about that from sort of the institutional architecture. And again, I think there's a lot to learn from where India has evolved to in that sense in terms of how the institutional architecture. I think another downside, obviously, that gets talked about a lot is privacy and user control and the ability of individuals to maintain and preserve their privacy. There are obviously dangers around exclusion as well, right? And there's dangers around too much information capture. Again, one of the nice things about the Indian model is the minimal amount of data that it collects compared to what other systems can do. So, and one of the other dangers is not necessarily a danger, but there's no real governance framework around data and these sorts of things. There are country by country frameworks coming up, but even in countries that have reasonable data protection authorities, there's still a lot of sort of anarchy around data, and in some cases lack of capacity. Good example, we've started working in Africa with UN ECHA. A good portion of the billion or so people without identification are sitting in Africa. Less than half the countries actually have a data law or data privacy law or data infrastructure around that, and that's a clear risk as well that needs to be addressed.
That's great. We're going to come back in 1 minute and dig into this good digital identity concept. But I want to give everybody else a chance to raise any other concerns you have. And actually, I have one specific question about the Indian case. The Supreme Court of India made an important ruling recently where they, as I understand it, underscored the importance of privacy as a fundamental right. They sort of endorsed the basic program, but also made some changes as it relates to the private sector utilization of the Aadhaar system. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what the concerns were that the court expressed?
So when the Aadhaar project was taken up, a number of people went to the court saying that it violates privacy and so on. And then that became a long drawn argument as to whether there is a privacy law in India at all, because the original constitution in 1950 did not mention privacy. So after a fairly long case, the Supreme Court said that yes, Indians do have a fundamental right to privacy. However, in certain situations, the state can circumscribe that right. And they said there are 4 situations, which is law and order, revenue, giving benefits, and tax collection. They said these justify, putting limits on privacy. But they said that any privacy limitation should be done through a law, and it should be proportional to the benefit that you're trying to get, and it should be reasonable in nature. So this is a conceptual framework that the Supreme Court laid down as a framework for judging whether a particular decision met the privacy norms. And then the Aadhaar project was tested against this judgment. And that's the Aadhaar judgment, which is a judgment, does Aadhaar meet these norms? And that is the second longest running case in the Indian Supreme Court, so it took a long time. I mean, in terms of number of days of hearings. Cases take a long time, all cases in India take a long time. But on number of days discussed, it was the second longest. And they said that, yes, Aadhaar meets these requirements of proportionality, reasonability, there's a law, etc. However, they said that the law to use it for private users is not, there's no law for that. And therefore, they struck it down on that basis. Recently, the government then went back to Parliament and issued an amendment to the law, which allowed banks, mobile companies, and people on a voluntary basis to use their Aadhaar. And that law has been passed by the lower court in India and will be taken up with the upper court. So basically, I think it's been a series of things, but fundamentally the Supreme Court upheld the privacy of Aadhaar.
Got it. All right, anybody else want to add anything on the, just the implications of digitization for privacy and how digital ID can affect that, or any other downsides to this movement toward digital ID for society?
No, I think there's a complexity, though, as we move from an architectural perspective from centralization to decentralization to distributed. And we've understood the vulnerabilities in centralization. We've seen some of that highlight, in the recent media with Equifax and even Facebook's, data exploration. But certainly there's a naivety in the complexity when you push things to the edge. And we have not yet had the experience of what it will mean in a truly distributed world where the risks are. And not only that, when we have applications in market at full production scale globally, what is the unintended consequences of those implementations? So for me, there's a big question mark over that. Now, we could certainly simulate and model the potential of what this could be, and maybe we could start to theorize what those risks are as we start to model back towards, centralized and then decentralized. But a truly distributed world is something that I'm certainly bullish on, but I'm also have a tempered view.
I would share the bullishness on decentralization and a more distributed world, but I also agree we are only scratching at the surface and trying to figure out what could unintended consequences be. How do we actually make this work at a really large scale?
Yeah, I feel like there's a parallel here. We went to the moon and we leapt, but we didn't settle there on that day. But I feel like we've said distributed data and distributed modeling and sort of decentralization is something that we definitely need as a part of society. But I felt like we've explored, leapt, and then settled in the very first instance. So there's something in the exploration of this that's really exciting.
For me, the other critical aspect is I feel like that in the last, 10, 15 years of the digital transformation, and I'm looking less at national legal ID and more at what we usually think about when we talk about digital ID. How do I identify myself online? How do transactions work? I feel we have for a long time not thought through the unintended consequences and not challenged this assumption that more is always better. Great, I get to this. Does this work? Yep. Yay. I feel that we're only now coming to a point with the data breaches where we're really beginning to understand the consequences of this more is better culture where because it became technically possible and ever cheaper and more feasible to collect as much data as you possibly can. And we as Mozilla started developing something we called lean data principles many years ago. And we're working with a whole number of organizations, commercial, non-commercial. What do good lean data practices look like? What does that imply? What is the purpose of collecting certain bits of information? Because we have seen that just everything that was collectible was collected. Why does Facebook trace me across the internet and store that data even when I'm not using it or I'm not even logged in? There are many open questions, and I think we need to have this more holistic conversation. What is out there? Who is collecting what? To what purpose and what intent? How long is something being stored? Because we don't talk about deleting data, the depreciation of value of data over time. What does that mean for our databases enough? And I think that, that takes us down a totally different rabbit hole, but those are questions we're only now finally realizing we should have asked those 10, 15 years ago. But before we venture deeper into a digital identity world, this is the time to do this and to be really clear on what are our data collection principles, what's the intent, who needs what.
Yeah, so for me, your comments bring us right back to that opening abstract question of what do you mean by digital identity? And if you start the conversation by talking about a national digital ID system for government services, your mind goes one place. if you mean it in the broader sense of your digital footprint and all the things you're leaving everywhere, every search, every purchase, every social media post, all being compiled, and the implications of that we haven't really gotten our heads around, that is a very different conversation. So, yeah.
But is it really a different conversation? Because I see this point where both merge really quickly, and I think you saw that in some of the controversy around Aadhaar and the case a little bit as well. If you have a solid national ID system, what keeps you from merging that with your other digital ID, of using that in other digital spaces? And do I really want my national ID also be the thing that identifies me online? I personally don't. I'm happy to have alternate identities online.
Absolutely, and there's a risk in distributed ledgers. There's a risk that it's at the edge, that it will propagate even faster than a centralization. So, we could have this viral effect. Not for the good. It could be catastrophic.
Yeah. All right, so let's get to the good. Let's go back to this concept of a good digital identity, a user-centric digital identity. I know that some people in this room that I was chatting with have been working on this. Mike, you've been working deeply on this. WEF has been, has got a big strand of work on this. As I understand it, that 5 elements have been identified as necessary, essential to a good digital identity. I will just name the 5, and I would love to dig into the meaning of those and whether there's a shared understanding of what it really entails. Number 1 being fit for purpose. Number 2 being inclusive. Number 3, useful. 4th, offering choice, and 5th, secure. From my vantage point, I read those top lines, and they all sound good, they sound neutral, but it's the concepts underneath those elements that actually do the work, because they so explicitly focus on users, trust, and individual choice. And so let me ask Mike to sort of dig into these concepts and help everybody understand how we got to, those 5 elements, and the likelihood that those 5 elements can become a global norm. And I'm going to come to the audience right after this segment, so think of your questions, anything to clarify anything that's been said, or to contest anything that's been said. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, great. And thanks for setting that up. First of all, so I think the definition of good ID will evolve, right? As more stakeholders engage with this discussion, either from a critical point of view or as a proactive point of view. This is the beginning, this is the beginning of work on digital ID that's really gotten underway recently. And so one is, we're hoping that through exchange and dialogue and engagement that this will be added to and refined over time. Second, in terms of some of those specific sort of initial sort of characteristics that we and others have laid out, inclusive we've talked about, right? Which is to say, it needs to be a means of empowerment and should not be excluding a community that wants to participate in this from the point of view, as Nandan was saying, of distribution of state benefits and other prerogatives. So it shouldn't be, and similarly, it shouldn't be used for exclusionary purposes, and so collect more data than is necessary. For instance, ethnicity is a field that should never show up in an ID system. Useful gets to the fact that while some systems like India have gained a lot of traction and a lot of viewership, there are a lot of ID systems. Actually, the second most used ID system in the world is Facebook, but after India's. But there are a lot of systems in countries like Nigeria, Mexico that have very low utility, right? And so that have low user rates, about 10-15%. There's a very nice McKinsey Global Institute study that just came out yesterday, which documents a lot of the use cases and the penetration rates in a number of countries. and there's a lot of good material in there. But for it to be useful, it means the individual needs to find value in it for the transactions and the purposes, and so it needs to get used. Otherwise, it's a simple, it's a lot of money to spend for a pretty low utility. And underneath all of this is the idea of building trust, right? None of this works. So a piece of the McKinsey report talks about somewhere between 3 and 13% of GDP can be generated by installing good ID systems by 2030. About 50% of that value accrues to companies and the state, and about 50% of that value accrues to the individual. That second 50% of the individual doesn't happen unless there's trust, unless it's useful, unless there's trust in the system, and that gets to the point about security. For instance, knowing that it's secure, it can't be hacked, and so some of these distributed technologies underneath that could be part of the answer to that as well. And the fact that the user has choice to opt in, to opt out, to use it when they choose, has choice of other ways to identify themselves as well, in addition to using their state ID. So fit for purpose means I don't need to show up. Everyone loves to give the example of you walk into a bar and you give them your driver's license that tells you every piece of identity about you, your age, your address, and that sort of thing, whereas the bar just wants to know that you're above 21 if you're in the States. And so fit for purpose would allow you to tokenize that piece of information in a way that's fit for that particular purpose, that doesn't have to share more information about you than is absolutely necessary to get that transaction done. So those are a set of sort of principles, but a lot of it really comes down to both the implementation at the technical level and the institutional architecture around. I think one of the, for all the controversy in India, one of the things we take note of in the Indian case is that the institutional architecture in India surrounding the system, and this is why at some level this is brand new, global databases and that sort of thing. In other cases, like they've had voter rolls for years, right? And there have been all sorts of lists that the government has of people, and there are rules about what you can have and what you can't, and about search and getting a court warrant, at least in some countries. And so, part of the key here is to also build up the institutional architecture, particularly in countries that may not have it. But in India, the case actually, you had an active civil society that was agitating importantly for privacy rights. You had a Supreme Court that took the case seriously, argued it for a long time, made a ruling. You have a parliament that's now responding in terms of the system. And so these systems are not simply just technical systems. They get launched into an institutional architecture that is every bit as important as the system and the system design choices. And so good ID is about the ID itself, sure, but it's also about what's the institutional architecture into which it's being regulated. And that's some of the ways that, at least from our perspective, you would deal with these issues of combining databases and that sort of thing, having rights and checks and reasonable independent data protection authorities and some of these things.
That's great. So I want to just ask the other three, do you think those 5 elements, inclusive, useful, secure, user choice, and fit for purpose, does that cover the range of things that you would say are essential to a good digital identity? But more important to Mike's point about institutional architecture and what level of political will is there to move toward this kind of a normative vision of a good digital ID, and what will it take? Any of you?
I think it's interesting. For me, it's missing accuracy. It's missing something that's really important, scientific certainty. I think about the work that we do in the identity of diamonds, and I can identify a diamond just by the characteristics, the external characteristics of that stone, but like the true identity of the diamond comes into play at a forensic level. And so without the accuracy of that identity, all of those other 5 attributes that you just spoke about, actually those 5 attributes tick every single box of Facebook. But on Facebook, my name is not my real name.
No, I would fundamentally disagree with that.
I'm glad we disagree. But certainly accuracy has to be one of the 5 principles around identity. It's got to be a core.
Does anybody disagree with that point? And then, Katharina, what do you disagree with?
Specifically, the remark that Facebook's current system adequately reflects
Oh,
or
those
has
other
implemented
elements.
those 5 elements. Because yes, I have a choice not to use Facebook, but once I do use Facebook, and it's incredibly convenient. It helps me stay connected. It's incredibly convenient as a digital identity because it allows me to log into almost everything on the internet. But it's a completely binary choice. Either I use it to log in or I don't. I have zero control over what does Facebook collect, how does it get stored, how long does it get stored, what of these pieces actually gets shared with the third party where I'm using this identity to log in, and yes, I can dig deeper into that, but then I still only have a binary choice to say yes or no. It's never really up to me to say I am happy to share this parcel of information, but I really am not comfortable sharing this parcel of information. And I'm constantly left worrying, am I oversharing accidentally? Because the system is really not transparent to a user. And despite all of the improvement that Facebook and other companies have taken on in the last couple of years, after a lot of controversy and conversation, as a user, and I would say that due to my work, I'm a pretty well-informed user. I actually do take the time to dig deep into the privacy stuff and constantly try to tweak what I do allow and what not. But the implementation, I would say, does not nearly live up to the good identity standards as articulated. And do we really need to talk about secure? I think the data breaches, and I don't even want to point the finger, we have seen so many across the board. This does not live up to what I would hope to is something we can agree on as secure. And coming from Mozilla, it will not come as a surprise that I would strongly advocate for more open source technology in those systems, and because that allows for potentially bigger security. It allows for more innovation and creativity because you have more people having eyes on it. And I would also strongly hope for more security audits of systems that I entrust my fundamental identity to. But then on the other hand, I don't think Facebook was ever designed to be this identity. It turned out to be this identity because it's incredibly convenient and it is commercially super successful, but it was not designed with these underlying principles and that intention.
So I want to go to the audience, but I have to say you two raise some pretty big fundamental issues, whether accuracy is essential and otherwise those other 5 elements can feed upon themselves and turn it to malign uses. And I also just want to, I'll come back to you, Mike, this issue of you're raising for me, would private sector entities like Facebook be willing to consider these elements or not? And what kind of resistance would there be there? I want to go to the audience, but super quick.
I just wanted to respond to the open source question because there's an interesting initiative that we've been working on that Nandan's been part of, which is recognizing this issue, recognizing that there's vendor lock-in in these state systems. We've been working with IIIT Bangalore. We and the Gates Foundation and the Tata Trust have funded an effort to build an open source ID set of software that would enshrine in code a bunch of things that you can't even necessarily guarantee in law: user choice, user ability to opt out, some of these things, to make that available as an alternative to the Morpho or the Gemalto system who shows up at the door. So that's a work in progress. Nandan, you may have more to say about that as well.
But I think the one thing quickly I just want to add is that ID systems should not also be data collectors.
Yep.
That's where the conflict of interest is.
Yep.
The challenge we have with Facebook and with Google, which she didn't mention, is that they provide both the ID and collect data. And when there's an economic incentive to collect data because you can monetize it through advertisement, there's no limit to the data you collect, and that's why we have the situation we have. That's why when we designed the Aadhaar system, we designed it by law that it does not collect data. It can be used by somebody else for verifying identity, but that information is retained in that system. So when the banking system verifies an ID, that data remains in the banking system. When the healthcare system uses the ID, that remains in the healthcare system. And it's also designed in a way that unless the law allows, that database cannot store the number, it can only store a tokenized version so that you cannot do the correlation. So I think people have to understand the subtleties to understand these.
That's also a very fundamental point, along with the accuracy point. Okay, so I want to turn to everybody here who's been listening. Love to hear any questions and concerns, clarifications, right there.
Yeah, picking up on the security, if I lose my passport, my credit card can replace it. In digital ID world, which is based on biometry, which is sitting on a cloud somewhere, everything is hackable. So if my identity, digital identity is hacked, I'm not going to change cosmetic surgery, I cannot change my face or my fingerprints. How do I get protected in that world if somebody steals my digital identity?
So I will add to that. I just read an article today about the Indian system, and an Indian civil society activist made that same point, that if hacked, it's your identity, and the consequences of that are gargantuan and lifelong, potentially. So maybe you could take that one.
Yeah, so first of all, I think there's also a concept called a virtual ID, which means that if I want to use, I don't want to reveal my ID number, I can use the virtual ID. So I can create a sort of a hashed ID of mine, which I use in all transactions, so that I don't give my ID away. And that can be used for all documents. So that's one aspect. The other thing is that we have to also see why the biometrics. The challenge was, how do we give people a unique number? And the only way to do that is with biometrics. And the design is such that once the deduplication is done, those biometrics are taken off the grid. They're no longer on the grid. They're no longer, it's not an online system on the internet. It's really kept encrypted and stored away. So I think it has a lot of special elements to it, because obviously everybody is very conscious of these kind of issues. And I mean, I don't get a whole technical discussion on how it's protected, but there are a number of things that it's doing.
We have something similar in diamonds. So we store the forensic view, the crystal line mapping and the thumbprint of that diamond. We identify that through scientific methods. We give the diamond a digital identity, and then that entire scientific method of identity, like the thumbprint for that diamond, is taken off chain.
Right. Anybody else from the audience? Right here.
6:30 we have to start.
I think one of the things that myself and others find sort of so inspiring about Aadhaar and the potential of digital ID systems is that a lot of the greatest social benefit can accrue to the people who are typically excluded, most marginalized, whether it's sort of making sure they get access to subsidies, cash transfers, services they didn't previously had. One of the greatest challenges with that we've seen in our work is that getting truly informed consent from a privacy perspective is incredibly difficult. How do you get, I'm sure many of us in the audience, consent for stuff that we don't fully understand with all the education in the world. How do you get truly informed consent from someone who might have 5 years of education in their entire lives? And does that responsibility lie with the individual, or maybe is there an institutional responsibility somewhere in that space for supporting that process or making sure it's robust enough?
So I want Mike or Katharina maybe to answer that one. Go ahead.
Well, I think there's a lot of work being done now on consent and what constitutes consent, and how much that gets telescoped, as you said, into situations where people don't consent. I think in general on the web we consent to a lot of things, even as you were saying, where you read the privacy documents and you don't realize it. So I think it's a bigger issue. I don't think we have a ready answer to how you address that. We've come at it more from the point of view of, that's why we think it's so important to have the opt-out, right? To just say at some point, particularly, right, people enroll their children all the time who are below the age of consent, and so to give them the opportunity that at some point, if they understand that this is not something they want, they have the ability to not use it or and to opt out. So to us, that's the way we've thought about coming at it. I think there are a lot of real-world examples where people confronted this directly. And
So it also gets,
Trying not
again,
to
to
do
that the need for institutional support in the form of digital literacy, digital security education, and even empowerment in terms of your ability to choose utilization of your data. So,
And I don't think there is you raise an incredibly important point that I don't think has a super simple answer. And is also a very multi-layered answer that also depends on what kind of identity are we talking about. If this is an identity that I absolutely need to, like a national identity, to participate in the very foundational things of everyday life, I think that shifts the burden way more towards the institution, because as a user, it leaves me much less room to opt out. If I want to have any kind of benefit, if I want to vote, participate anywhere, I cannot opt out of that. I think if we go away from this national question more to our everyday digital identities, I would assume, or I think it is a shared responsibility, but I'm very wary of the tendency we see right now to spend money on digital literacy, believing that this will fix everything, because I think it shifts the burden unfairly to the user. Because if you make really bad implementation choices as a company, if you design the implementation really badly, it doesn't matter how well educated I am. I still will not be able to figure out how this works, or it will be so painful. If you look at, this is going to be unpopular, but if you look at GDPR, for example, I'm European. I'm a strong believer in good regulation, in data protection regulation. I like the idea of GDPR. I'm not going to complain about it. The implementation is hideous. It's like, this is not helping me, even as like a very educated user. I give up halfway through. I'm just going to say, sure, I accept it because I really need this piece of information or whatever it is. It is so badly designed that it doesn't really help me. And I think it's wrong to put the entire onus on the user.
okay, we're coming to a close. So I want to ask the panelists just to give a couple of wrap-up comments. And I want you to imagine the world 5 years from now. And what does it look like in terms of global adoption of a user-centric approach to digital ID, with those elements that are protective of the individual and they're inherently empowering, inclusive, they provide user choice, security. Where do you see the embrace of that, either from governments or the private sector? Are you sanguine about where we'll be in 5 years, or do you think we'll still be in a place where those elements are not well developed and people are still digitally at risk?
Well, I think really, a private sector ID system will be biased towards collecting data for profit. A public sector ID system will be biased towards collecting data for surveillance. That's the nature of the beast. And therefore, I think we have to make sure that when we design the systems are designed legally, technologically, to not to collect data. And so I think unless we do that, then you won't get what we want.
Mike?
I think we would share that assessment almost entirely. I do think there will be a lot of momentum on the public sector side just because of the SDGs, particularly in countries that have not done them. So there will be pressure and funding coming from the UN and the World Bank in these places. So I expect to see a lot of movement, and that's why getting the institutional architecture right in these places will matter, and that's going to be hard. And I think on the private sector, it would be good to see some standards and norms evolving 5 years from now. It'd be good to see some standards and norms evolving around that. But I agree, I think the incentives are in the other direction.
Katharina?
I agree the incentives are in the other direction, but I also feel so much has happened in the last few years. There's something dramatic in the news almost every day. If you look at the private sector commercial identity system, I feel it's not only policy wongs and security experts discussing this now, it's a much broader public discussing this, I hope that there is ongoing momentum to push for better user choice, more informed choice, more control, less data collection. Depends on bad days, I'm a cynic and I think that it's not going to change because the economic incentives are too big. On good days, I believe that we as civil society, we as users and the other side of a commercial transaction, that we can actually use this momentum, gather together, engage in a more participatory consulting process and push for more positive change.
Leanne, you got the last word.
Always the last word. Look, I certainly think from a technology perspective, the accuracy of identity cannot just be held within a digital form. There has to be sort of a hybrid or a double helix between the physicality of us as human beings and the devices that we hold in our hand, or the interaction layer with the digital world. So I think if we think about it in 5 years' time, even voice as an identity is really starting to shape the way that we think about identity as well, and even interaction with applications. So from a technology perspective, we'll have to bring them all together. It's a hybrid.
Okay, well, let me say thank you to all the panelists. Thank you all for staying with us, and let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.